How did Harry Truman, a son of the heartland, a man who spent more years on a farm than in the Senate, end up in the White House? It's a story that began on a small farm in Lamar, Missouri, where he was born on May 8, 1884. His parents, John and Martha Ellen Truman, were tough, no-nonsense Midwesterners. His father was a livestock trader who taught his son the value of hard work and perseverance. From his mother, who studied arts and literature at a Baptist women's college, Harry got his love of books and music. Early on, Martha Ellen noticed something different about her son Harry, pictured here with brother Vivian.
My grandmother thought it was rather strange when one 4th of July, he didn't react to the rockets and the things going off. So she took him to an eye doctor in Wichita, Kansas. It was the closest one. And he said, this boy needs glasses. He's very, very nearsighted. And from then on, he wore glasses.
Wearing thick, round spectacles immediately set Harry apart from other boys his age. While they played sports, he studied the piano and read books. He was fascinated by history and dreamed of becoming a great soldier like his hero, Andrew Jackson. John Truman's job trading livestock kept the family moving from farm to farm until 1890, when they settled in a small frontier town of Independence, Missouri. It was here that Harry first set eyes on 5-year-old Bess Wallace, a girl in his Sunday school class. Harry always claimed that for him, it was love at first sight. The Wallaces were the most prominent family in Independence, and Bess, confident and popular, was Harry's ideal. In 1901, he graduated from the local Independence High School. In the class photo, we see him standing almost hidden in the back row, still far too shy to sit next to Bess. After graduation, Harry tried to get into military school, but failed the eye exam. College was also ruled out when his father went bankrupt.
His father got into grain futures, which was not very smart of a man who, like John Truman, didn't have all that kind of money. Unfortunately, what money John Truman did have, he lost, and that meant that Harry had to go to work.
Harry spent 11 years working on his grandmother's 600-acre farm in Grandview, Missouri. But all that time, he never forgot Bess Wallace. In 1910, he was visiting his aunt in Independence when she asked him to return a cake plate to the Wallace home.
Bess answered the bell. There was that big, strong farmer looking at her, and I think he was looking at a very pretty young woman. And it was an instant sort of take.
9 years of courtship followed as Harry tried to settle on a career other than farming that would satisfy Bess's mother. But like his father, Harry didn't have much of a knack for business. Take the time in 1916 when he and 2 partners invested in an oil drilling company.
They had a lease over what later became known as the Teeter Pool, which was a marvelous pool of oil in Oklahoma. And they drove down their well. I think it was something like 1,200 feet. It was necessary to take the pipe down a little more. They didn't do it, and they narrowly missed becoming millionaires.
At 33, Harry was beginning to think he'd always be a farmer and never get married, when suddenly the United States entered World War I. At last, Harry would get his chance at military glory. To get past Army doctors, he memorized the eye chart. And finally, whether it was the uniform or the possibility of never seeing him again, Bess promised to marry him when he returned. Harry rose quickly, becoming captain of an artillery unit. The boys of Battery D were a rowdy bunch who had already scared off 3 commanders. The 3rd put in for a transfer after just 90 days. McKinley Wooden, one of the last of the boys of Battery D, was the company's chief mechanic.
Harry come in, he was firm. He was hard-boiled and firm, but he was fair, see? when Harry addressed about it, why, he says, I didn't come over here to get along with you fellas. You're going to get along with me. Well, the boys come back in the tent there, and I says to an Irishman, I says, Mike, what do you think of the new captain? 90 days, 90 days.
But Truman lasted a lot longer than 90 days. The men soon learned that Captain Harry was a tough, decisive leader who would see them safely through some of the worst fighting of the war.
World War I was undoubtedly the turning point in Truman's life. It was not merely going abroad, but it was the opportunity for leadership, perhaps that more than anything else. When he became a company commander, he was the boss, you might say, of almost 200 men. He had never had that experience before. And he carried it off wonderfully. And then the knowledge that he could do that, I think, ensured his future.
In the 29 years since he first fell in love with Bess Wallace, Harry Truman had never given up hope that she would one day be his wife. His persistence finally paid off when they were married on June 28, 1919, in the Episcopal Church in Independence, Missouri. After a short honeymoon, they moved into the Wallace home at 219 North Delaware Street, where Bess suffered 2 miscarriages before giving birth in 1924 to their only child, Mary Margaret. By then, Harry and one of his wartime buddies had opened a haberdashery in Kansas City. For a time, business was booming. Then, a post-war recession wiped them out. Facing huge debts, Harry gladly accepted an offer from notorious Kansas City boss Tom Pendergast to run for county commissioner.
Truman went into politics. I think we just simply have to say this because he was a business failure. But the fact was, Truman had all of the qualities that were needed for a county judge in the rural and largely Protestant eastern part of Jackson County. He was a Baptist. He had lived in the county since he was born, and he was a candidate that the Catholic machine in Kansas City very much needed.
With the powerful Democratic machine behind him, Truman won the 1923 election easily. Susanna Gentry, a reporter for the local newspaper, remembers seeing the new judge around town.
When he used to come into the Examiner, I thought, now that's a nice man. He always walks so straightforward, and he always wore his hat, and he walked like he was going someplace, and he was, but we didn't know it.
Harry was indeed going someplace. In 1934, with the powerful Pendergast machine behind him, this county judge was elected U.S. Senator. He kept a low profile during his first term, voted the party line, and supported Roosevelt's New Deal policies. But once again, the outbreak of war would change Harry's life. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, U.S. production shifted into high gear. To monitor this massive effort, Truman organized a Senate committee to investigate waste and corruption in the National Defense Program. The committee's work saved taxpayers an estimated $15 billion. And suddenly, people were talking about that senator from Missouri. Democratic Party leaders, disenchanted with incumbent Vice President Henry Wallace, convinced FDR to offer their new rising star a place on the ticket. At first, though, Truman was reluctant. There was something he didn't want to come out in a campaign.
Namely, that he put his wife on the payroll in 1941, and by 1944, in the time of the convention, Bess was drawing $4,500 a year, which was a high salary in those days. And in 1943, he put Mary Jane, his sister, on the payroll at $1,800 a year. Mary Jane did not even go to Washington until her brother was president in 1945.
Truman's concerns were quickly brushed aside. You tell him, said Roosevelt, if he wants to break up the Democratic Party in the middle of a war and maybe lose that war, it's up to him. Naturally, Harry reconsidered. On November 7th, 1944, FDR made history as the only president elected to 4 terms in office. He posed obligingly with his new vice president, but beyond the pictures had little to do with him, leaving Truman ill-informed on foreign affairs and unprepared for what followed.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin from CBS World News. A press association has just announced that President Roosevelt is dead.
My mother came around the corner from the bedroom in the apartment where she'd answered the phone, and she said, "The president's dead." She had tears in her eyes.
With the country still at war, Harry Truman was suddenly in charge.
I remember writing a headline, "We took our star to wish our Harry well." We figured that nothing too much bad could go on in Washington with Harry Truman running things.
I, Harry S. Truman, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office.
Taking the oath of office, 60-year-old Harry Truman looked stunned. As he told reporters, "I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." The reaction of the country was summed up in the look on Bess's face. The new president faced tremendous challenges. Just 3 months after he was sworn in, he flew to Potsdam, Germany for his first summit meeting with Churchill and Stalin. The date was July 7th, 1945. Germany had surrendered, but fighting continued in the Pacific. Among those who accompanied Truman was a young military aide named George Elsey, who had also served under Roosevelt.
FDR had a tendency, particularly in his later years, to let matters drift and put off making decisions if he could put them off. That was not Truman's method of operation then or at any time in his administration. He wanted to make a decision, get on with the next subject, and that was the way he handled himself at Potsdam.
At the top of Truman's agenda was a task FDR had not been able to accomplish: getting Stalin finally to send Soviet troops to fight in the Pacific.
He was very relieved and very pleased when Stalin did assure him that they would come in within 3 months after the Germans surrendered.
During the meetings, Truman received a coded message: "The baby is born," which meant America's secret weapon, the atomic bomb, had been successfully tested in New Mexico. After careful consideration, he made one of the toughest decisions an American president has ever had to make. On July 23rd, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, telling the Japanese to surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. By August 6th, it was clear the Japanese had rejected the ultimatum.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe.
A few days later, a second bomb exploded over Nagasaki.
Truman was very sensitive to what it meant to dropping a weapon like this, a new weapon, on civilians. He said in cabinet not long afterward that he didn't want to do that again.
I don't think Truman worried about dropping the bomb. He realized what a horrible weapon it was. But the point was, it stopped the war.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
atom bomb, he did not lose any sleep over that because he knew that he had saved hundreds of thousands of American soldiers' lives. And I have many men, not so many now because they're getting a little bit old, they used to come up to me and say, you know, your father saved my life by dropping the bomb.
In the first happy post-war days, the country got a chance to know its new president. In contrast to Roosevelt, whose health had been declining, Truman looked remarkably vigorous. Each day, he'd get up at 5:30, have breakfast, and go for one of his famous constitutionals, his morning walks, which reporters said were more like sprints. Stick with me, he told them, and I'll make men of you. Here was a president who didn't mind being photographed in funny hats, loud sports shirts, who loved to take the presidential yacht down to Key West, Florida, where he could swim, do some fishing, and best of all, play poker with the boys. Clark Clifford remembers one game when Supreme Court Chief Justice Fred Vinson got a little too caught up in the camaraderie.
The rule was you never called the president anything but Mr. President. Vinson said to President Truman, who was dealing, he said, hit me. And the president flipped off the towel. I can see it coming out. It was the Queen of Spades. It destroyed his hand. And Vinson, without thinking, it just burst from him with him. He said, why, you S.O.B. The president said, what?
And then Truman got his own share of criticism for using off-color language.
They thought he cussed a lot, which he certainly did not. He knew how from the war, but I never heard him use a cuss word in my life.
Susanna Gentry had the same impression until she asked a male colleague about it.
I said, I never heard him cuss. He said, of course you didn't. You're a lady. But he said, he sure could cuss.
For the most part, Harry enjoyed being in the public eye, but Bess found it an ordeal, as Rethel Odom, her personal secretary, remembers.
One of the press girls called, and she said, what is Miss Truman wearing tonight? And I turned around and I said, what are you wearing to the reception tonight? She said, tell them it's none of their damn business. And I said, oh, she hasn't made up her mind yet.
After a christening Bess attended was made into a newsreel, she would try even harder to stay in the background. As the Trumans tried to adjust to all the press attention, the country was struggling with the new peacetime economy. 1946 was a year marked by rising inflation and labor disputes, which reached a peak in May when union leaders called a national railroad strike.
It was the worst possible event that could take place insofar as our economic recovery was concerned. The president went up to the Hill and made a speech to the joint session of Congress saying that if they struck, he was going to use every governmental weapon that he had to force them not to strike at that particular time.
I request the Congress immediately to authorize the President to draft into the armed forces of the United States all workers who are on strike against their government.
Halfway through that speech, his labor advisor sent a note in.
Word has just been received that the rail strike has been settled on terms proposed by the President.
Though he'd forced labor to back down, Truman's tough stance didn't win him many friends. And in the next election, the Democrats lost control of both houses of Congress.
It was a very serious setback to President Truman. Many people regarded him as sort of a temporary expedient anyway. And then to have the populace vote against him in the off-term elections diminished his standing with the country.
The kind of man who always said, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. Harry went back to Congress again in 1947, this time demanding aid for Greece and Turkey, free countries threatened with communist takeover.
Should we fail to aid Greece and Turkey in this fateful hour, the effect will be far-reaching to the west as well as to the east. We must take immediate and resolute action.
Providing support for countries fighting communism came to be known as the Truman Doctrine, a cornerstone of American foreign policy. It was one of the last programs the president would get through Congress without help. When he and George Marshall came up with an even wider-ranging foreign aid program, Truman let his Secretary of State do the talking.
Whether we like it or not, we find ourselves, our nation, in a world position of vast responsibility. We can act for our own good by acting for the world's good.
In April 1948, the European Recovery Program, better known as the Marshall Plan, was passed into law by an overwhelming majority.
General Marshall was very much against calling it the Marshall Plan. But my father said, if you don't call it the Marshall Plan, it'll never get through Congress. So even though it was mostly my father's, it's called the Marshall Plan. And yet General Marshall had tremendous input into it.
It's sometimes been said that Truman saved the world from communism through the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. What these great measures did was to inform the Soviets that they were going to have some opponents, some opposition. And what these measures did, I think, was to save Western Europe, which might have collapsed into communism.
The possibility of a collapse was underscored in June 1948 when the Soviets suddenly imposed a blockade on West Berlin, cutting off supplies of food and fuel. Truman immediately launched the Berlin Airlift, a solution that avoided the use of force and probably another war. For one full year, around the clock, the U.S. flew supplies into the city. Planes brought in more than 4,000 tons of supplies each day. Until finally, the Soviets were forced to lift the blockade.
These momentous programs constituted what became really known as the Truman foreign policy, the policy of containment. And each successive administration followed it. And finally, by 1989, it bore the ultimate fruit. Communism began to disintegrate, and the Soviet Union was no more. This is the great debt that the United States and the rest of the world owe to Harry Truman.
Biography will continue in a moment here on A&E. Truman, the son of Confederates, surprised many with his strong position in support of civil rights. On June 29, 1947, he was the first president to address the NAACP.
There is no justifiable reason for discrimination because of ancestry or religion or race or color.
And at the 1948 Democratic Convention in Philadelphia, Truman insisted the party platform include a civil rights plank, causing 35 Southern delegates to storm out in protest. As tempers in that hot, crowded convention hall flared, there was talk among some delegates of drafting General Eisenhower as their candidate. But finally, at 1:45 in the morning, Truman and running mate Alvin Barkley got the nomination. By contrast, at the Republican convention, support for Governor Thomas Dewey was unanimous.
I pledge to you that on next January 20, there will begin in Washington the biggest unraveling, unsnarling, untangling operation in our nation's history.
With pollsters setting odds against his winning at 20-1, Harry Truman set out on a grueling 22,000-mile cross-country tour. Home movies shot by a member of his staff chart that trip across the heartland. At each small town or whistle stop, Harry got out to meet the people. Despite the warm receptions he got, just about every newspaper in the country still said he didn't stand a chance. But as was typical of Harry, the first sign of a challenge only made him work harder.
Rates of inflation are continuing to grow. The cost of living is continuing to rise. I've been urging price control because it is a realistic way, a tested way, of holding down the cost of living.
At first, crowds and reporters thought Truman sounded rehearsed. So his staff urged him to try speaking off the cuff.
It was much better to let him relax and let Harry Truman be Harry Truman. And the whistle stop epitomized Truman in his direct, colloquial style, wanting to reach out and speak directly to communicate with his audience in his manner so that they could understand who he was.
This Republican Congress has already stuck a pitchfork in the farmer's back. Now, my friends, the record of that 80th Congress is a sad tale of the sellout of the people's interest. The Republican Congress asking for big business has already begun its attack to break the strength of labor unions.
Truman never missed a chance to take a jab at his old foe, the Republican Congress. In Seattle, when someone hollered, "Give 'em hell, Harry," he shouted back, "I never gave anybody hell. I just told the truth on the Republicans, and they thought it was hell." That became a standard crowd pleaser, as was his Meet the Family routine.
I'd like very much to introduce to you the First Lady. This is Margaret.
I enjoyed coming out and waving at people. I used to worry sometimes when they crowded so very close to the back of the train. Of course, that car of ours, the Ferdinand Magellan, weighed 14 tons. It weighed as much as the engines up front. And one time we were going across Colorado, the engineer was trying to make up time. And I saw my father look up like this. He was looking at the speedometer. And I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "He's going much too fast." He said, "Get up and go and tell somebody. Even if we're late, I want him to slow down." If he had had to slam on the brakes for anything, the whole train would have been telescoped.
Traveling at a much more leisurely pace, Governor Dewey and his wife toured the country on their train, the Victory Special. Supremely confident, Dewey campaigned like a man who had already won. As he said, "All I have to do is not rock the boat."
Dewey, it turned out, was an appallingly bad campaigner. He couldn't give a speech, and the result was a very wooden campaign on his part.
In the meantime, the Truman campaign was gaining momentum.
The crowds got larger, whereas we would expect 500, we'd have 2,000. If we expected 2,000, we'd have 5,000 or 6,000. Something was going on. We began to get a lift. President Truman began to get a lift from it. I remember thinking one time, my God, if we had a little more time, this could be the upset of the century.
By the time they got to Minnesota, Truman's optimism was spreading.
He said, "Elsie, take a pad and let me go through the states." And he began Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, dictating each of the then 48 states with the electoral votes for each state. So I toted them up in columns. And he predicted his own victory by a very substantial margin. I thought, well, if he has that conviction, then I, too, will believe he's going to win.
Election Day, 1948. Experts were still forecasting a Dewey landslide as the nation went to the polls. Commentator H.V. Kaltenborn.
No one knows, hours and hours after the polls had closed, who is to be the next President of the United States.
As reporters slept, Truman carried state after state. Finally, in the early morning hours, a winner was declared. Harry Truman had won the greatest political upset in the nation's history, a surprise to everyone except Harry. At a victory dinner, Truman, now president in his own right, couldn't have been happier as he described how he had spent election night.
Along about 12 o'clock, I happened to wake up for some reason, and the radio was turned on the National Broadcasting Company. And Mr. Kaltenborn and Mr. Harkness were reporting the situation as it then developed. And Mr. Kaltenborn was saying, well, the president is 1 million votes ahead in the popular vote. We have yet to hear. Very sure that when the country vote comes in, Mr. Truman will be defeated by an overwhelming majority. And I went back to bed and went to sleep. Along about 10 o'clock, I got a telegram which said that the election was over and that I should be congratulated on the fact that I had won the election, and apparently it was too bad, but it happened.
Everybody loves a winner, and for a while, that's just what Harry Truman was. Reporters couldn't get enough of his folksy Midwestern style. Political cartoonists saw him in a whole new light. It was a far more confident Harry Truman who took the oath of office on January 20th, 1949. He got his second term off to a strong start by announcing plans for NATO, a military alliance of 11 non-communist countries.
The substance of NATO was that we would come to their assistance militarily. And it sent a message to Stalin which said, if you attack any one of the NATO countries, you're attacking the United States, and it means war.
But this Western alliance did not stop communist aggression in another part of the world. On June 24th, 1950, North Korean forces suddenly stormed across the 38th parallel into South Korea. President Truman called a meeting with his new Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, to discuss the terrible prospect of sending U.S. troops once again to fight on foreign soil.
We had to resist the North Korean incursion or run the risk of South Korea collapsing. Mainland China had already succumbed to communist control. It was a painful and bitter decision, but at the time it seemed no choice but to go in with troops.
By October, a UN military force under the command of General Douglas MacArthur had recaptured the South Korean capital. Truman flew to Wake Island in the Pacific for a strategy meeting. In private talks, the president made it clear he didn't want the fighting to escalate into another world war. MacArthur reassured him, the boys will be home by Christmas. But MacArthur could not keep that promise. On November 24th, China suddenly entered the war, sending 300,000 troops to reinforce the North Koreans. As the fighting dragged on, the general ignored orders to contain the war and publicly demanded permission to bomb China. pushing Truman a step too far.
MacArthur was actually directly insubordinate, and no president, before or since, could tolerate a commander in the field who violated orders from the commander-in-chief.
I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea. A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
MacArthur didn't take dismissal quietly. On his return to the States, he was given a hero's welcome, turning the situation into a public relations disaster for Truman. With his popularity at an all-time low, the president would suffer through some dark days, which were all the more lonely if Bess was on one of her frequent trips to Independence.
He'd come in and he'd say, "Is there any mail for me from Mrs. Truman?" He said, "I'm going to fire all of you if there isn't any." And we'd be so happy when we'd have a letter to give to him.
Bess and Margaret meant everything to Harry. When a music critic once wrote a very unflattering review of one of Margaret's singing recitals, Truman wrote the critic a letter threatening to punch him in the nose. Not very presidential, but to this day his daughter is grateful to her dad when she remembers that review.
The man who wrote it was a frustrated baritone. And when Dad wrote the letter, I was glad that chivalry was not dead. As I was on tour, after I went on, it sold tickets.
By the time the 1952 elections rolled around, Truman had decided not to run. The country blamed him for getting us into the Korean War, and now looked to someone else to get us out.
That job requires a personal trip to Korea. I shall go to Korea.
Eisenhower defeated Adlai Stevenson by a landslide. Washington was now a Republican town, and Truman was ready to retire.
He would have lost to Eisenhower. Anyone would have lost to Eisenhower. And besides, he was tired. He had had enough. He was 68. It was time to leave.
We're back home now for good. I'm in the army of the unemployed now, although it's a very small army, and we do thank you immensely for this wonderful welcome. I don't see how anybody in the world could have a better one. Thank you very much.
Back in Independence, the Trumans took up residence again at the old house at 219 North Delaware Street.
I saw them mostly when they were in their late 70s and through their 80s. I have a mental picture of a very close couple, two people that did not have to say a whole lot to each other and were very comfortable with that. A look or a nod or a few words was all it took.
Harry devoted most of his retirement years to building the Harry S. Truman Library. Just blocks from his home in Independence, the library was where Truman would play host to a number of distinguished guests. And Harry, who never stopped taking his morning walks, was quite a familiar figure on the streets of Independence.
Everybody that had ever known him as a senator and as a schoolmate even wanted to speak to him, and he had time for everybody. And he just had a human touch.
Truman's retirement years were happy years, spent in the town he loved. But in 1972, old age finally caught up with him. On the day after Christmas, at the age of 88, Harry Truman passed away. In his 8 years as president, this man from Missouri had shown the world he could make tough decisions without flinching and stand up to the challenges of the Cold War. And yet when he left office, Harry Truman was one of the least popular presidents in U.S. history. Only in recent years has his reputation grown.
In relation to his successors, Truman began to look better, and with the presidency of Richard M. Nixon, he looked awfully good. There is a statistic that shows what presidents rated at the time of their presidency and then how they improved later. And of all those presidents, Truman has had the largest increase in rating. He is now considered one of the great presidents of the United States.
The difficulties that confronted him would have swamped a lesser man. And through it all, he didn't change a whit. After 7 3/4 years in the presidency, he was the same simple fellow that had come into the presidency almost 8 years earlier.
When people come up to me on the street and talk to me about my grandfather, it's not, boy, I love that Marshall Plan, or gosh, you know, what a good bomb drop that was. What they say is, your grandfather was a great guy. He told it like it was. He was honest. He worked hard. Give him hell, Harry. That's what they remember.
As Mrs. Truman and I leave the White House, we have no regret. We feel we have done our best in the public service. I hope and believe we have contributed to the welfare of the nation and to the peace of the world. And now the time has come for me to say good night and God bless you.